Plant-based versus vegan. Which is better? What are they? What's the difference? In this episode of Plant-Based Eating for Health, I'm going to break it down into terms that hopefully everyone will understand. What the difference between being vegan is and what the difference between a plant-based diet is compared to veganism. Stick around.
Are you ready to live the life you deserve? Do you want to feel vibrantly healthy and reach your optimal weight without dieting while being kind to animals and the planet? Then you're in the right place at the right time. Welcome to Plant-Based Eating for Health with your host, certified plant-based nutritionist, Kathleen Gage.
And today we're going to talk about the difference between plant-based versus vegan. There's a difference. A lot of people use those terms interchangeably, but the reality is that one can be different than the other. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is plant-based is about eating as many plant-based foods as you can, but it does not mean necessarily that you give up all meat and dairy. Many plant-based eaters do. Now, vegan, on the other hand, is a term that was coined in 1944, and I just got a great education by London Todd. I interviewed him on my podcast show, Vegan Visibility. The episode is the most current episode. And in his book, Rebel Vegan, he gave an incredible history lesson on where the term vegan came from, what the truth about eating meat is, and how far back it goes that people were actually plant-based eaters more than meat eaters. And we've been led to believe by the food manufacturers that, yes, in fact, we are meat eaters, have been for a long time. It's the natural thing to do. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. And first of all, I've got my plant-based snack, and this could be considered a vegan snack. It could be considered a plant-based. These are little corn or carrot slices. I have a food slicer, and I just took a couple of carrots. I peeled them, and then I sliced them, and I've got a nice little afternoon snack that curbs the sugar craving. It curbs the energy slump, anything you want. I've also got water here. And I've got water here, and I've got some really great mix in it from Isogenics, which my good buddy, Pat Musser, she represents Isogenics, and she makes sure that I have this really great stuff that is plant-based vegan. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between vegan and plant-based. Again, vegan is somebody, it's more of a philosophy and a way of life than it is a diet. And a vegan is somebody who is void of all animal and dairy food consumption and consumption in other areas of their life. For example, their clothing, their makeup, their hair products, their shoes, their furniture, the seats in their car. Now, before anybody gets up in arms about the fact, well, I've got leather seats in my car. I have leather seats in my car, and I'm not going to sell my car. I bought the car before I went vegan, and actually it's a great car. It's great transportation. There's no reason that I need to sell it. When I bought it, I was not vegan. So the thing about being vegan is we go through layers of being a vegan, but it's a philosophy about doing no harm or as little harm to animals as we possibly can. Plant-based eating, on the other hand, is somebody who chooses to eat a highly plant-based diet. And that means they eat vegetables, they eat fruits, they eat beans, they eat legumes, they eat nuts, they eat natural oils like avocados and, like I said, nuts. Now, there are some plant-based eaters who actually are whole food plant-based eaters, vegan, which means they don't consume any animal or dairy, but they eat primarily plant-based foods. And it's not just salads, like what I showed you for my little snack. It's not just that. What it is it's a diet that is very high with nutrient value, and it's as close to nature as possible. Now, you do have raw plant-based eaters, just like you have raw plant-based vegan eaters who eat their food raw. That's another segment of the vegan and plant-based communities. But the main thing to look at is when people, I belong to a lot of LinkedIn groups, Facebook groups, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, and it's always interesting when people say, I tried that vegan diet. Well, that's the first area that you know that they're not a vegan, because veganism is not a diet. It's a way of life. It's a philosophy. Plant-based eating, on the other hand, can be a diet, and the two can be mutually exclusive or they can be mutually inclusive. It really depends on what somebody is choosing to do. So how does somebody know if they're vegan? Well, somebody knows they're vegan if their main driving force is to bring as little or no harm to the animals. And when I first changed my eating style, I became a plant-based eater. I was not a vegan. I didn't want to be identified as a vegan. I thought vegans were crazy. I thought they were too radical. And about 6 months into my journey, I actually realized, yes, in fact, I am vegan. And it happened when I was at the grocery store. I was walking by the meat department, and I literally stopped in my tracks. I mean, it was just like this overwhelming feeling of grief and sadness came over me. And I was just like, wow, what is going on? And then I was just, it was the most incredible experience where I could feel the pain and suffering of the animals that had given up their life to be in the meat department. Now, the thing that is so interesting about people's perspective about beef and about chicken and about fish and about any type of animal-based product is they seem to think that there's a humane way to kill animals. I don't agree with that as far as a humane way to kill animals to create food. Now, if an animal is suffering, if they're in pain and you euthanize them, that's one conversation. That is truly a humane way to take them out of pain. However, on the flip side, if in fact an animal is being bred merely for the fact of creating a food source, and they're being artificially inseminated, they are actually being forced into insemination, and that those are called rape racks that these animals are put in order to inseminate them. So let that sink in. They're put in rape racks, and then they are inseminated. Then they have babies. The babies are immediately taken from the mothers, and some of the babies are destroyed. Some are put into confined areas, like in the case of eating veal, which it's not much practiced anymore, but it used to be. I remember growing up, my mother loved veal, and I had no concept what that meant. And I was definitely a carnivore growing up. But the thing about the food consumption with meat consumption is that these animals are bred against their will. These animals are brought into the world against their will. These animals are raised in very horrendous and cruel ways against their will. They are given antibiotics and steroids and medications against their will, and then they're killed against their will. That doesn't seem like a very logical way to get food on our plate, and it's very unhealthy when you think about the cholesterol, you think about the toxins, you think about the fact that most pandemics are zoonotic diseases, that the virus is passed from animals to humans. And so it's just logical to look at this and say, okay, if in fact pandemics come from the fact that we are consuming meat and pandemics are being spread from animals to humans, wouldn't we do everything in our power to minimize the intake of meat? I've been listening to the audiobook of Joe Dispenza on becoming supernatural. And in it, he shares a story about some people that had organ transplants. And what was interesting about that is the people who had the organ transplants, they actually took on personality traits of the people that they got the organ from without knowing who these people were. There was one example where a woman who very feminine, very petite, when she got a new, I don't even know, kidney or lung or whatever she got, she actually started craving certain foods that she had never, ever eaten in her life. And somebody in her family said, "You're acting like such a dude, you know, what's going on?" And they found out that it was a young man that used to use the term, "you're acting like a dude." And he used to eat a lot of junk food. And she was craving that after she got his organ put in her body. There's another story of a young woman who had a heart transplant. And after she got the heart transplant, she started having dreams and nightmares about being murdered. Well, as it turns out, the person she got the heart from had been murdered. And she actually helped solve the mystery of who the murderer was. This is all in Joe Dispenza's book. Now, what's interesting is people will believe that, but then they don't believe that energetically, when we put these animals who are in pain and suffering and fear into our body, that we take on those traits. If you look around at the amount of fear that's going on, you look around at the amount of pain that's going on, the suffering that's going on, and how much meat and animal products are being consumed by people. It's kind of interesting when you see that correlation. But going back to the difference between vegan and plant-based, somebody who is vegan it's about a philosophy. It's about the fact that they, in mind, body, soul, do not want to bring harm to the animals. They do everything in their power to minimize the harm that's brought to animals. They can be a junk food vegan. That's something that's interesting too. A lot of people think if somebody goes vegan, they're going to be super healthy. That's not true. There's a lot of processed vegan food out in the market, and there's more coming every single day. Where a plant-based eater, for the most part, they're eating for health, and yet they may consume small amounts of meat. So they're not vegan. The ultimate, in my mind, is when you combine a vegan and a plant-based eater into one package. That's the ultimate, because not only are you bringing as little harm to the animals as possible, but you're eating as healthy as possible. Now, if you're wondering, well, where do I get information on this? There's a few resources that I'm going to recommend. And if you have a pen and paper, go ahead and write this down. The first one is Eat to Live by Dr. Joel Fuhrman. Eat to Live by Dr. Joel Fuhrman. Excellent, excellent book on acquiring the taste for a plant-based diet, which, speaking of acquiring a taste, a lot of people, they say, oh, I couldn't give up cheese, or I couldn't give up chicken, or I couldn't give up whatever it is they can't give up. And it's not that you can't give it up, it's that you won't give it up. And also considering that many of the foods that you consume, especially if you consume processed foods, they are designed to get you addicted. Read the book Salt, Sugar, Fat by Michael Moss. That's Salt, Sugar, Fat by Michael Moss, and it will be an eye-opener. He also wrote a book called Hooked, like you're being hooked, and that's exactly what the food manufacturers are doing. So Michael Moss is another author that I highly recommend. As far as the energy of what you put into your body, I would recommend The World Peace Diet by Dr. Will Tuttle. The World Peace Diet by Dr. Will Tuttle. I actually had the good fortune of interviewing him on my podcast show, and it was a fabulous, fabulous interview. And he talks about the energy of what we put into our body. And when we're putting all that pain, fear, and suffering into our body, it has to go somewhere. So again, veganism, more of a philosophy. It means you eliminate all animal and dairy products from your food consumption. Plant-based eating means that you consume a diet high in plant-based foods like vegetables, fruits, beans, legumes, nuts, healthy fats. And then there's the level of the plant-based no SOS, which is no added salt, no added oil, no added sugar. And if I was to say I battled with anything, it's the sugar or the salt intake, because salt can be hidden in a lot of things, as can sugar. So if you're going to eat processed foods, regardless of whether you identify as a vegan or a plant-based eater, read the labels, because the more that you eat close to nature as possible, the less you're going to have to deal with this. But read the labels and look at how much sugar is added to the products that you buy. Spaghetti sauce, for example, is filled with sugar. Look at how much added salt goes into it, and really look at how you can take control of your health, because the reality is that we are a very, very sick society. Put the pandemic aside. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, cancers, obesity. All of that is in epidemic proportions, and it has to do with our eating patterns. And again, a lot of this has been out of our control. A lot of this has been a direct result of what the food manufacturers have done to get us hooked on their foods. This is Kathleen Gage with Vegan Visibility. I encourage you, go to Vegan Visibility, like it sounds, veganvisibility.com, and you'll be able to access a lot of great resources. If you want to check out my podcast shows, I have two. One is Plant-Based Eating for Health. That's Plant-Based Eating for Health, and Vegan Visibility. So if you go to Apple Podcast, if you go to Amazon, if you go to Google Podcasts, and you just key in my name, all of my shows will come up. And again, I encourage you to really look at what you're doing on a daily basis to either move you closer to your health goals and live a healthy, vibrant life, or what you're doing that's moving you away from that. I encourage you to live a life of vibrancy, live a life that you put healthy foods into your body, live foods into your body, by eating this rather than a candy bar. Oh my gosh, my energy is going to be so consistent throughout the afternoon, where if I ate a candy bar, I'd go on a sugar high and then I'd crash and burn. I'm really, really excited to see what's happening with food manufacturers that are offering more plant-based options, and to encourage you to really be conscious about the food choices you make. This is Kathleen Gage, wishing you a great day.
Thank you for your commitment to an ethical life through plant-based food choices. The kind of choices that are kind to your body, the environment, and most of all, animals. Be sure to leave a review and rating of the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show.